The man who sat across my kitchen table every Sunday, praising my cooking and calling me Walt like a son, had no idea I was watching him eat with the very hands he used to forge my signature and drain my retirement. For nearly 2 years, Kenny thought he was pulling off the perfect heist against a clueless old man. He didn't know that while he was reaching for a second helping of my ribs, the trap had already been sprung, his accounts were frozen, the DA's financial crimes unit was waiting, and I was just playing along to watch him walk straight into the jaws of his own greed. You're listening to Revenge Blueprint, the home of quiet men who let their patience do the talking. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end. Because the most chilling part of this story isn't the $43,000 he stole. It's what I realized about why my late wife, Carol, never trusted him from the very start. My name is Walt Donovan. I'm 67 years old. I spent 26 years with the Shelby County Sheriff's Department in Tennessee, starting as a patrol deputy in 1988 and retiring as chief deputy in 2014. That's not a title that means much outside the building. It means I was the second in command to the elected sheriff. I managed 600 plus employees, and I spent 2.5 decades reading people for a living. I want to be specific about what that means, because it matters to this story. When I say I read people, I don't mean I'm psychic or I have some special gift. I mean that when you spend that many years interviewing suspects, witnesses, victims, and everybody in between, you develop a pattern recognition that you can't fully turn off. You notice when someone's answer to a simple question takes a beat too long. You notice when a person's hands do something their face hasn't caught up to yet. You notice when the laughter is 6 inches ahead of the joke. These are not dramatic observations. They're small. They're the kind of thing you file away and don't necessarily act on immediately, but you don't stop noticing them. That part doesn't have an off switch. I'm telling you this because it's relevant. And I'm also telling you this because I need to be honest. I noticed things about Kenny Mears for 4 years before any of this happened, and I didn't act on them. Not because I was foolish, because I was a father and a father-in-law. And I had learned over the years that there's a difference between reading a suspect in an interview room and reading the man your daughter loves. I bought the house on Shelby Drive in Collierville in 1989. Carol picked it. She drove past it on the way to her school where she taught 2nd grade and called me from a payphone to tell me I needed to come look at it that afternoon. 3 bedrooms, good neighborhood, pecan tree in the backyard that she said she'd always wanted. I asked her how big the kitchen was. She said it was big enough for the table her mother had left her. We signed the papers on a Thursday in April. We moved in on a Saturday. We have had Sunday dinners in that kitchen every week since the autumn of 1989. With the exception of a few Thanksgivings when we traveled to see family, the 2 Sundays I was tied up with a major case, and the 8 months Carol was in treatment and then hospice. She died in March of 2017, pancreatic cancer. She was 61 years old. We had 34 years. I am not going to dwell on that the way some men dwell on it. What I'll say is this. Carol was the sharpest reader of people I ever shared a life with, and she did it without the benefit of 26 years of law enforcement training. She did it with patience and attention and the specific quality of a woman who had been listening to 2nd graders tell her the truth their whole lives and had developed a fine-tuned sensor for the difference between someone trying to tell you something and someone trying to avoid telling you something. She also had a quality I've rarely seen in anyone else. She could hold a read on a person for a long time without acting on it and without letting the person know she was holding it. She would watch. She would ask small, specific questions that looked like ordinary conversation and weren't. She would file what she collected in a patient, unhurried way, and when she had enough, she would tell you what she thought, not as an accusation, not as a demand, just as a fact she had arrived at carefully and was now offering you. She did this with me about 3 times in our marriage, on topics I'd been avoiding for reasons I'd told myself were practical. She was right all 3 times. The conversations were not comfortable. They were necessary, and she knew the difference. She taught 2nd grade at Bailey Station Elementary for 27 years. Every year in September, she had a new set of children who needed to be understood, and she did the work of understanding them quickly, honestly, with the specific patience of a person who knows that children tell you who they are if you pay attention to how they move through a room as much as what they say. She brought that quality home with her every day. She trusted Diane's judgment about most things. She was not certain about Kenny. She never said that directly. It was in the way she passed food at Sunday dinners. She would pass things to him last, which she only did with people she wasn't sure about. It was in the way she talked about him with Diane, always about what he was doing, never about what he was like. A small difference. I noticed it. I think Diane noticed it. We didn't talk about it. Carol died without ever saying it out loud, and I respected that because she was making her own calculation about what mattered and what could wait. It waited longer than it should have. My daughter Diane is 39 years old. She teaches 5th grade at Collierville Elementary School, has taught there for 12 years. And by every account of parents and students and administrators I've encountered in that time, she is excellent at it. She has Carol's patience, which is the most valuable thing Carol could have left her, and a warmth that is her own. She married Kenny Mears in June of 2016 at Christ Methodist Church on Bailey Station Road. I walked her down the aisle. I danced with her at the reception. I said everything a father says at his daughter's wedding, and I meant all of it. They have 2 daughters, Emma, who is 11 now, and Sophie, who just turned 8. Both of them come to my house on Shelby Drive about twice a month when Diane brings them. Emma has her mother's eyes and her grandfather's habit of being quiet before she says something important. Sophie talks constantly and has not yet developed a filter between thinking and speaking, which I find deeply charming and also exhausting in exactly the right proportion. I mention the grandchildren because they are part of why I handled this the way I did. What I did carefully. Not because I'm a careful man by temperament, I'm not. I'm direct. I was trained to be direct. And my natural instinct when I discovered what Kenny had done was to drive over there and say it to his face on the front porch. But I had 2 grandchildren who ate dinner in that house 3 nights a week. And I had a daughter who, at that point, still believed she was in a good marriage. And I had 26 years of experience watching what happens when people with evidence act on it too fast, before the case is complete. Fast gets you the wrong result. Patient gets you the right one. Kenny Mears grew up in Brentwood, which is one of the wealthier suburbs south of Nashville, the kind of place where kids grow up expecting a certain level of things and have to adjust, sometimes painfully, when real life doesn't deliver them on schedule. His father had been in commercial banking and done well in the 90s, and Kenny had a memory of financial ease from childhood that he spent most of his adult life trying to recreate. He was charming. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. He was genuinely, naturally charming, the kind of person who walks into a room and 3 minutes later people are laughing with him without quite knowing how it started. He remembered what you told him. He asked follow-up questions. He made you feel, for the duration of the conversation, like you were the most interesting person he'd met that week. I recognized this quality when I first met him because I'd interviewed a lot of charming people in my career and had a specific relationship with the trait. Charm is useful. Charm is also a tool. And like any tool, it can be picked up by someone who doesn't have the character to use it right. He told Diane he was a commercial real estate investor. That was partly true. He had made some legitimate deals in the mid-20s, bought a distressed commercial property in Franklin, renovated it, sold it at a profit. Made enough to convince Diane and himself that he had a future in it. What he didn't tell her, and what I didn't learn until much later, was that the deal that made his reputation had involved borrowed money from 3 separate investors and had succeeded largely by luck at a time when the market was generous to everyone. When the market tightened, his methods didn't change. His results did. At Sunday dinners, Kenny was relaxed and engaged. He grilled with me on the back deck. He asked about my time at the department without the fake interested quality some people get when they're performing attention. He asked specific questions and remembered what I'd said the previous week. He helped Diane in the kitchen without being asked. He played with Emma and Sophie in the backyard with a patience that seemed genuine. He had a good laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and doesn't require an audience. He remembered Diane's birthday with real presents, not rushed ones. He called Carol Mrs. Donovan right up until she died and switched to something warmer only in memory, which I thought was respectful. These were real things. I want to be clear about that. The problem with Kenny Mears was not that he was a transparently bad person. If he had been, we wouldn't be talking about 4 years of Sunday dinners. The problem was that he was a skilled person who used his real qualities to cover the ones he was hiding. That's the specific form of betrayal that costs the most, because you can't get back the trust you gave freely to the parts of him that were genuine. The first year after the wedding was the easiest year to read. Diane was happy, the particular happiness of a person who has been patient with their own life for a long time and has finally found the thing they'd been patient for. She was lighter than I had seen her since before Carol got sick. She called me on weekday evenings sometimes just to talk, which she had done as a teenager and had done less as an adult. I took this as a sign of genuine contentment, and I believe it was. Emma was born in September of 2017, 6 months after Carol died. The timing of that was both hard and necessary. The way certain timings in a family's life are both things at once. I was at the hospital. I held Emma in the recovery room for about 15 minutes while Diane rested, and I thought about what Carol would have looked like in that moment, the way she would have taken the baby with both hands, and that particular expression of hers that combined complete competence with complete joy. I am not going to linger on that. What I'll say is that Emma's arrival gave me something specific to be present for, and I was grateful for it. Kenny, in that first year of fatherhood, was good. Patient with the nights, useful in the mornings, able to make Diane laugh when the exhaustion was landing on her in the way it does with new parents. Sophie came 3 years later. By then, the rhythms of the family had settled into the specific patterns they would have for the next several years. Sunday dinners at my house, weeknight dinners at theirs, Christmas Eve at mine, Christmas Day at his parents in Brentwood. I noticed 3 things that I filed away. I didn't analyze them. I didn't act on them. I just noted them the way I'd been trained to note things. The first was the way he talked about money. Not what he said, what he didn't say. When financial topics came up at the table, Kenny would redirect smoothly. Not awkwardly, not defensively. Smoothly. Like a man who had practiced the redirect. He'd acknowledge the topic, say something plausible, and move the conversation somewhere else before anyone had a chance to ask a follow-up. After the 3rd or 4th time, I recognized the pattern. It was the conversational equivalent of a driver slowing down near a checkpoint without quite stopping. I noticed it first in a conversation about his business in the fall of 2018. He'd mentioned a property deal in passing, described it in general terms, used confident language about the current market and timing the renovation cycle. When I asked a follow-up question about the specific property, he answered with another general sentence, then turned to ask Emma about her spelling test. Emma was 11 months old. She couldn't spell. She laughed, which was what he wanted, and the conversation moved to Emma's laugh, and the financial topic evaporated. It was smooth enough that I didn't process what had happened until I was driving home that evening. The second was something smaller. In my first year with the department, an older detective named Frank Collier told me that you learn more about a person from how they treat objects than from how they treat people, because objects can't be impressed. Kenny was careful around things that mattered to other people. Too careful with a particular kind of too careful that I've seen in people who have learned to perform respect rather than feeling it. He'd move Carol's china bowl from the center of the table like it was in his way, without acknowledging what it was. Not aggressively, just practically, the way you move something that has no particular significance to you. Once, in the spring of 2020, he nearly used it to serve chips. He had it in his hand and was walking toward the cabinet to get a bowl for chips, and it was only when Diane said his name from across the kitchen that he stopped. He looked at the bowl in his hand with a puzzled expression, like it hadn't occurred to him that it might not be available for chips. He put it back. He got a different bowl. The conversation moved on. I watched all of that from the doorway. I noted it. The third thing I noticed was the speed of his affirmations. When someone who is lying tries to seem trustworthy, their agreement arrives slightly too quickly. It has an eagerness to it that isn't present in honest agreement. Kenny's nods and absolutely's had that quality sometimes, not always, but sometimes. I noted it. I am telling you I noticed these things. I am also telling you that for 4 years, I did nothing with them because they were not evidence. Because my daughter was happy. Because I was retired from the department and no longer in the business of building cases on my family. And because Carol had never said anything out loud, and I had decided to respect the position she'd taken. That position became harder to maintain in October of 2022 when I got a phone call from a young woman named Justine Cole. Justine Cole was 23 years old and had been working at the First Tennessee Bank on Schilling Farms Road for 8 months. She was, by her own description when I later met her in person, thorough by nature. She told me her supervisor called this slightly annoying but ultimately useful. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon in early October. I was on the back deck. The pecan tree had started dropping, and I was sweeping for the second time that week. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. She identified herself, gave me the branch address, and said she was calling about a withdrawal request that had come in that morning. She said this was a routine verification call for large transactions, which I noted was technically true but also slightly more than routine, given her tone. Mr. Donovan, she said, we received a withdrawal request this morning for $18,500 from your secondary IRA account, along with a power of attorney document authorizing an agent to act on your behalf. Before I process this, I just wanted to confirm that you authorized this transaction. I was quiet for a moment. I was still holding the broom. I did not, I said. She didn't respond immediately. I heard her breathing. Then, all right, sir. I'm going to place a hold on this transaction while we review the documentation. Would you be able to come in at your convenience? I said I'd be in the following morning at 9. I hung up. I stood on the back deck for a few minutes. The pecan tree was doing what it always did in October. There was a paper bag in the garage from the last time Emma had been here to collect pecans. I want to be precise about what I felt, because I think precision matters here, and I don't want to dramatize it in a direction that isn't honest. What I felt was not panic. It was not grief. Not yet. What I felt was the specific, cold clarity of a person who has just received information that confirms something they suspected without knowing they suspected it. It's a particular sensation. In the department, we called it the lock when the last piece slides into place, and the case that had been fuzzy suddenly has edges. I didn't call Diane. I didn't call Roy yet. I went inside, set the broom against the wall, poured a glass of water, and stood at the kitchen counter for about 5 minutes. Then I went to my study, opened the center drawer of my desk, and looked at the folder where I kept my financial documents. I knew roughly what was in my secondary IRA, a retirement account at First Tennessee I'd opened in 2003 and contributed to irregularly, less organized than my primary accounts. I hadn't reviewed the statements closely in about 18 months. That was the first mistake I could own in this story, and I'm owning it. I called Roy at 7:30 that night. Roy Callahan was my sergeant for 18 years. He retired 2 years before me and had gone to work with the Shelby County DA's Financial Crimes Unit, not as an investigator exactly, but as a consultant who understood the law enforcement side of fraud cases. We had breakfast every other Tuesday at the Cracker Barrel on Highway 72. He was the right call. He picked up on the second ring. I need a favor, I said. Something came up. Not urgent enough to go through official channels yet, but I want your eyes on it first. Yep, he said. Tomorrow or Thursday? Tomorrow, I said. Breakfast. I'll be there, he said. That was all. Roy doesn't need sentences to work with. He has never once in his life asked a question he didn't already need the answer to. I went to the bank at 9 on Thursday morning. Justine Cole was exactly what I expected from her phone manner, precise, a little careful, slightly younger than she probably wanted to seem. She had the POA document in a folder and laid it on the table in the small office where they brought me to talk. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the document. My name. My handwriting, sort of the way a man signs his name when he's trying to copy someone else's handwriting accurately enough to pass a quick review. Close. Not close enough, if you knew what to look for. The signature on file for your account, Justine said, sliding a comparison card across the table, is from when you opened the account in 2003. The 2003 signature was mine. The loop on the D slightly different, the way the second letter runs into the third. 26 years of writing my name on documents under pressure. And I know my signature the way I know the route to the courthouse. The POA signature was a good imitation. The loop on the D was close. But the second letter running into the third, it didn't have the specific connection that comes from writing the same name for 40 years. It had the connection of someone who'd practiced it 10 or 15 times and committed. This isn't my signature, I said. Justine nodded carefully. She had a pen in her hands that she wasn't using. I suspected that might be the case, sir. I wanted to verify before I processed anything. I asked her for the withdrawal history on the account. She printed it out and slid it across. I looked at the page. 17 transactions over 22 months. The amounts ranged from $900 to $4,700. None large enough to trigger the automatic fraud review threshold. Total, 43 cents. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. I'm going to need you to hold all transactions on this account and not process anything new, I said. I'll be in contact with your fraud department. I'll also be contacting law enforcement. She nodded. She looked at me with the careful look of a person who is trying not to ask a question they probably shouldn't ask. Then she asked it anyway. Sir, do you know who did this? I looked at her for a moment. I appreciated the question. It was exactly the right instinct. I have a good idea, I said. I drove home. I sat in my truck in the driveway for about 10 minutes, not doing anything in particular. The pecan tree was visible from where I was parked. I could see a couple of pecans on the ground near the back corner of the house. 22 months, 17 transactions, 4 years of Sunday dinners, the ribs, the green bean casserole, the china bowl he moved to the side because it was in his way. Emma and Sophie on the back deck chasing each other around the pecan tree, while Kenny grilled and told me what he knew about the commercial real estate market in Memphis. I went inside and called Roy. Roy Callahan is 69 years old. He's from a small town in western Tennessee, worked the department the way a person works, something they were built for, and never once in 18 years gave me a reason to question his judgment. He has a quality I have always valued. He listens completely before he responds, and when he responds, it's never more than necessary. We met at the Cracker Barrel the next morning. I gave him the withdrawal history printout and told him what Justine had said. He read the page twice, very slowly. Then he set it down and picked up his coffee. Power of attorney with a forged signature, he said. Yes, 22 months. He picked up the page again, looked at the dates. He started 7 months after the wedding. I hadn't done that math yet. He was right. Kenny and Diane married in June 2016. The first withdrawal on the list was January 2017. 7 months in, Roy put the page down again. He looked at the parking lot window for a moment. A couple with 2 small kids was pulling out of the lot. He watched them go. What do you want to do? He said. I want to know what I'm dealing with before I do anything, I said. Full picture. His business situation. Any other accounts I might not know about. Whether this is isolated or part of something larger. I can run that, he said. I need it quiet, I said. Diane can't know yet. He nodded once. He drank his coffee. How much does she know about his business? He asked. What he tells her, I said. Which, based on what I'm looking at, was selected information. Roy was quiet for a moment. There's something I'm going to tell you now, he said, and I need you to hear it the right way. Go ahead. In financial fraud, the signature forgery is usually not the worst part. It's not even the crime they're most worried about. The signature is the tool. What matters is where the money went. If it went into a business that was already failing, it's a different situation than if it went into a lifestyle or a gambling account. I said I understood. Either way, he said, it's a felony. Forgery, financial exploitation, elder financial abuse under Tennessee statute depending on the amounts and the relationship. But understanding where the money went tells you whether this was a man who panicked and made a series of terrible decisions or a man who had planned this from the beginning. That distinction mattered to me. Not for legal reasons. Legally, it didn't change much. It mattered for Diane. The story I would eventually have to tell her was different depending on the answer. Roy spent 10 days on it. He made calls. He used relationships he'd built in the DA's office carefully, keeping the inquiry informal while he confirmed the basic shape of the situation. He also connected me with a financial crimes investigator named Andrea Torres, who was thorough and professional, and who within 3 weeks had built a picture I could follow. Kenny Mears had been running commercial real estate deals through a self-managed LLC since 2014. He'd had some early success, that much was real. His first renovation flip in 2016 had produced a return of about $34,000, which was enough to get him some local credibility in the investor community and to convince Diane that he knew what he was doing. He invested that return in a second deal, which also worked modestly. The early wins created the confidence and the reputation that let him bring in outside investors for larger deals. The trouble started in 2020. A commercial property deal in Midtown Memphis stalled during the early part of the pandemic when contractors went quiet and permits slowed down and the refinancing he'd planned didn't come together. He lost money but recovered, partly by borrowing against a personal line of credit he'd opened in 2019. He did not tell Diane about the line of credit. He rationalized this as protecting her from stress. That was probably true. It was also the first time in the marriage that he chose concealment over conversation about something material. And that choice, once made, became easier to make again. The collapse that mattered came in 2021. A large renovation project in East Memphis, a converted commercial strip he was turning into mixed-use retail and apartment, went sideways when his general contractor walked off the job mid-project, citing unpaid subcontractor invoices. The disputes were real. Kenny had delayed payments to manage cash flow between deals, and when the contractor left, 3 subcontractors filed liens on the property. Construction costs had ballooned. The timeline had slipped 6 months. He had been holding investor money, roughly $67,000, from 3 people who trusted his track record, and he had been unable to return it when the deal fell through. He didn't file bankruptcy. He didn't call the investors. He didn't tell Diane. He told himself, apparently, that he would fix it before anyone found out, that the next deal would produce the return that would cover the shortfall, and then it would all balance out and no one would need to know. This is the specific mathematics of a person in financial panic, and I have seen it many times. It is always wrong. The next deal almost never comes in time, and even when it does, there is always another shortfall waiting beneath the one you just covered. Instead of fixing it, he began looking for additional capital sources. That's when he got my secondary IRA number. I don't know exactly how. My best guess, from what the investigation produced, is that he found the account number on a document in my study during a period when he was helping me with something around the house. I had given him a key the previous year when he and Diane were staying over regularly. He would have needed access to my desk at some point, and I left my financial folder in the center drawer, which I've owned for a long time and regard as private in the way you regard things that are yours. The POA on my secondary account was one piece of that strategy. He had also, according to the investigation, borrowed against a line of credit he'd opened in Diane's name without her knowledge. That detail I didn't have yet when I sat across from him at the November Sunday dinner, though Roy had flagged it as a possibility. I got the full confirmation 3 weeks later. I want to pause here and say something about what this period was like. It was the last week of October. The leaves on the pecan tree had turned. I had swept the back deck twice since the phone call from Justine. I was going to Tuesday breakfast with Roy, but our conversations had changed. They were shorter, more precise, operating at the compressed frequency you use when you're working a case, and don't want to leave anything on the table you'll need later. I had not told anyone outside of Roy and Len Hooper what was happening with Kenny. That kind of silence is a specific discipline. It's different from not saying anything because you can't find the words. It's the silence of a person who has decided, deliberately, that the right time to speak has not yet arrived. I have practiced that kind of silence my whole career. It doesn't get easier with personal stakes. What it gets is more consequential. The longer you hold it, the more you understand exactly what you're holding. What I was holding was the fact that my daughter had been living for nearly 2 years in a house with a man who had been systematically dismantling the financial foundation of her father's retirement without her knowledge. And she didn't know. And when she found out, which she would, because that's what happens when the case is complete and the evidence is clear, she was going to go through something I could not fully protect her from. I thought about that a great deal during October. I thought about Carol, about how she would have wanted this handled. I thought about Emma and Sophie, who came to my house and collected pecans and told me about school and didn't know anything. I thought about the Sunday dinners still ahead of me, and the bowl on the table, and what it meant to sit across from a man who was stealing from you while your granddaughters drew pictures at the same table where your wife had hosted Sunday dinners for 25 years. I could only make sure the case was complete before anything moved. Len Hooper has been my attorney for 20 years. He is 71 years old, practiced in Shelby County for 4 decades, and has the specific quality of a man who has spent a lifetime in law, understanding that the law is a tool, and like any tool, its effectiveness depends entirely on the timing of its use. I called Len the week after my meeting with Roy. I told him the situation. He listened without interrupting, which is what Len does when he's being useful. When I finished, he was quiet for about 5 seconds. Then he said, "The account with First Tennessee, that's your only secondary account with limited recent oversight?" "Yes." "Primary retirement accounts?" "Well documented. Separate institution. No POA on file anywhere." "Property?" "House is in my name alone. Deed clear. No liens." "All right," he said. "Here's what I recommend. We freeze the First Tennessee account formally through the bank's fraud process. We send written notice to the bank revoking all third-party authorization on any account in your name. We review all your accounts for any documentation you didn't sign. And we wait for Andrea Torres to complete her investigation before any of this moves to the DA's office formally." "That timing," I said. "I need her to have a complete case before anything happens publicly." "I understand," he said. 2 reasons. First, an incomplete case gives him warning and time to move or hide assets. Second, Diane. "Yes, you want to be able to tell your daughter the complete story," he said, "not a work in progress." "Correct." Len did everything he described within a week. The accounts were locked down. He sent me a simple letter confirming what had been done in plain language. I put it in the desk drawer with the withdrawal history printout. I kept going to Sunday dinners. This is the part that people ask me about the most when I've told this story in private. The people who know me, who know what I did for a living, they ask how I sat across from Kenny week after week during this period and acted normal. The short answer is that I have done this my entire career. You sit across from people who have done terrible things and you have a conversation and you do not show them what you know, because showing them what you know before you're ready will collapse the case and let them walk free. I have done this in interview rooms with people who had done significantly worse things than Kenny Mears. I have done it with people I didn't understand at all. Doing it with someone I knew, someone who had sat at Carol's table, who ate my ribs, who my granddaughters called Uncle Kenny, was harder. Not harder because the discipline failed, harder because the discipline worked perfectly and I could feel the cost of it. The second Sunday after I'd met with Len, Kenny reached past Carol's bowl to get the salt without acknowledging it was there. The bowl was full of roasted potatoes. Diane had made them the way Carol used to. I watched him reach past it. I poured myself another glass of sweet tea and talked to Emma about whether she wanted to play soccer next spring. The idea for what I'm going to describe next came from Roy, not from me. He had worked enough financial fraud cases to know the standard pattern. Forgers, he told me over breakfast one morning in late October, have a specific vulnerability. They got to this point because they believe the risk-reward calculation still works in their favor. The calculation is, the person I'm defrauding is either not watching, not capable of noticing, or not likely to act. As long as that calculation holds, they keep going. You want to change the calculation, I said. I want to give him a reason to attempt one more transaction, he said. Something large enough to be worth the risk. Something that will produce documented evidence of a new attempt with a clean chain of custody separate from the existing transactions, which he might be able to argue in court were authorized by a verbal agreement or a misunderstanding. I thought about that. The argument a good defense attorney makes, Roy continued, is that a power of attorney was discussed between family members informally, and the document was a formalization of an existing arrangement. That's harder to argue when the account being accessed is one the defendant has never been told about because it eliminates the informal arrangement defense entirely. What do I need to do? I asked. Tell him there's an old CD account that finally matured, Roy said. $70,000 or $80,000. You've been meaning to figure out what to do with it. You're not sure which bank it's at, you'd have to dig through some old paperwork. I thought about it for a few seconds. If he's smart, he waits. If he's smart, he waits, Roy agreed. But he's not in a position where waiting is comfortable. He's still covering the original loss. He's got Diane in a house whose finances he's partially depleted without her knowing. He's going to want to act. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 days. The ethical dimension of planting false information bothered me. Not because it was illegal, it wasn't, and Roy had confirmed this with Andrea Torres, but because I was going to be using my daughter's trust in her husband against him, and there was a version of that where Diane became a tool in a trap I was setting for her marriage. I didn't like that dimension. I sat with it for the 3 days, and then I decided Kenny had already made Diane a tool. He had been using her household and her children and her family relationships as cover for a scheme that had been running for 22 months. I wasn't using her. I was stopping the use of her. The distinction was real and it mattered. The following Sunday, I waited until Diane had taken Emma and Sophie outside to look for pecans on the back deck. They still did this occasionally, though it was more habit than interest now. Kenny was in the kitchen with me, helping himself to another piece of the apple cake Diane had brought. Kenny, I said, I meant to ask you something. I was going through some old paperwork last week and I found a statement from a CD account I opened back in 2006. Matured in 2019, but I never touched the principal. Something around $78,000. I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure which institution it ended up at. Could be First Tennessee, could have moved when they restructured. You know your way around that kind of thing better than I do. You think you could help me track it down? I kept my voice at its ordinary register. Mild. The way I ask about practical things, Kenny's expression did one thing in the second after I finished speaking, and then did a different thing. The first thing was the kind of alertness that doesn't belong in that moment, a sharpening that lasted maybe a third of a second and then was covered. The second thing was the helpful, capable version of him that he performed so well. Sure, he said. Happy to help with that. You have any of the paperwork? It's somewhere, I said. I'll dig it out. Might take me a couple of weeks. No rush, he said. I nodded and started washing the dishes. Roy had told me the likely timeline. If Kenny was going to move, he would spend a week or two trying to confirm the account existed through legitimate channels, find that he couldn't, and then attempt to access it using a forged document based on the assumption that an account he'd never seen before would have less rigorous signature comparison on file. Roy and Andrea Torres had set up what they needed at the bank. The specific branch, the specific alert, I didn't know exactly when it would happen. I just waited. It happened on a Wednesday morning in late November. I was in the garage reorganizing the tackle box, a project I'd been putting off for about 6 months when Roy called. He came in this morning, Roy said. 10:47, had a new POA document plus an account number he'd obtained I don't know how. Andrea's team was there. They had a deputy. A pause. He asked to speak to a manager. The manager introduced him to Andrea. I set down the tackle box. He say anything? I asked. He said it was a misunderstanding, Roy said, that he was acting on behalf of his father-in-law, that there had been a verbal arrangement. A brief pause. Walt, he gave them your phone number. Said they could call you and you'd confirm. I sat with that for a second. That was the tell I'd been waiting for. Not the forgery, the phone number. A man who panics gives you a way out. A man who planned gives you nothing. What happened after that, I asked. He sat there for about 20 minutes while they made some calls. Then Andrea spoke to him formally about the existing case. He asked for a lawyer. That's where it ended for this morning. And the new document? Clean chain of custody, Roy said. Completely independent from the previous transactions. His defense attorney is going to have to address that separately. I thanked him. I sat in the garage for a while after we hung up. The tackle box was open on the floor. Through the garage door, I could see 2 pecans that had fallen near the base of the tree. I went inside and called Len. Len and I talked for 40 minutes that afternoon about timing. The case was being formally handled now. Andrea Torres would file with the DA's office. There would be charges. Kenny knew he was under investigation. Diane was going to find out, and it was better that she find out from me before she found out through a process server or a call from Kenny's attorney. I called Diane at 6 o'clock that evening. I asked her to come by the house without Kenny, without the girls if she could manage it, as soon as was convenient. That evening or tomorrow morning. Dad, is everything all right? She asked. I need to tell you something important, I said. I'm fine. Just come when you can. She came at 7:30. She sat at the kitchen table. I sat across from her. Carol's bowl was on the counter behind me. I'd moved it earlier for no particular reason, and I hadn't moved it back. I told her everything. I started with Justine Cole's phone call and went in order through every step. I showed her the withdrawal history printout, the dates, the amounts. I explained the forged POA. I told her about Roy and Len and Andrea Torres. I explained the trap and why I had decided to use it and what had happened that morning. I told her all of it as plainly as I could because she deserved the whole picture and not a softened version. She sat very still. She didn't interrupt. She looked at the printout for a long time when I slid it across the table. Then she said, "How long have you known?" 7 weeks, I said. Since Justine called. 7 weeks. She said it without inflection, not angry yet, just processing. I needed the case to be complete before I brought it to you, I said. Incomplete information about something like this. I understand why, she said. I understand the logic. She was looking at the printout still, not at me. I'm asking because I need to count backward from when I had the right to know. That landed the way she meant it to. I nodded. Diane, I said, I was wrong to wait as long as I did. That's on me. She looked up at me then. Her eyes were dry, but the set of her jaw was the specific expression she has when she is working very hard to stay contained. She looked a great deal like Carol in that moment, not just in the face, but in the way she was holding herself. There's more, I said. Roy flagged something. There may be a line of credit in your name that Kenny opened without your authorization. You'll need to pull your credit report and go through your accounts carefully. Len can help. She was quiet for a long time. Emma and Sophie don't know, I said. No, she said. Of course not. She pressed her fingertips against the table. How serious is this? For him, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, potentially financial fraud if the investors from the 2021 deal pursue civil action. The DA will decide on charges. I paused. Serious enough. She nodded slowly. She looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. He's home right now, she said. I know. She thought for a moment. If I go home tonight, I'm going to have to look at him. She said it quietly, almost to herself. You can stay here, I said, as long as you need. She looked back at me. Whatever expression she'd been holding back arrived, and it was complicated, grief and anger and something like exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a weight they didn't know they were carrying and has just been told what it was. The line of credit, she said. How much? I don't know yet. Roy estimates between 14 and 20,000. She closed her eyes briefly. She stayed that night, in her old room. I heard her on the phone, laid her voice low, steady, the way she talks when she's being careful with what she says. I don't know who she called. I didn't ask. In the morning, She had coffee at the kitchen table before I was up, and when I came downstairs, she looked like she had been sitting there for a while. Her hands were around the mug. Carol's bowl was on the counter where she'd put it the night before. She said, "Tell me again what Len said I need to do first." I told her. Diane did not take my side immediately. I want to say that clearly because I think it's honest and because it says something true about what it means to be a person in the middle of this kind of revelation. She went home 2 days later. She confronted Kenny. He denied it at first, gave her the version he'd given Andrea Torres. Misunderstanding, verbal arrangement, acting on Walt's behalf. He was convincing enough, and she was frightened enough of what the alternative meant that she spent about 4 days in a suspended state of not quite believing me and not quite believing him. I understood it. I have watched enough people receive difficult information to know that the first reaction to something that shatters your understanding of your own life is almost never acceptance. It's negotiation. You spend a few days trying to find the version of the story that preserves the most of what you believe before the information arrived. You try on interpretations. You look for the angle that makes the person you love still be what you thought they were. Diane is a smart woman. She is not naive. She had simply been in a marriage for 6 years, and she had 2 children with this man, and her whole household financially, emotionally, logistically had been organized around the assumption that he was who he said he was. Dismantling that assumption was not going to happen in an afternoon. I knew that. I was patient. During that time, she called me twice. The calls were short, careful. She was civil, but there was something withheld in her voice, a distance, that told me she was in the hardest part of this, the part where the person you love is asking you to choose between them and the evidence. I understood it. I didn't push. I told her Len's number was available whenever she was ready and I'd be here. The third day, she called just to ask me a specific question. "Dad," she said, "you said he accessed the account 17 times over 22 months. Can you tell me the dates of the first one and the last one?" I went to my desk drawer and found the printout. First one, the 14th of January 2021, I said. Last one, the 3rd of September 2022. She was quiet for a long moment. Emma's second birthday was the 17th of January 2021, she said. "We had a party at our house. You came." He grilled. I didn't say anything. "He started 3 days before Emma's second birthday party," she said. "Yes." Another silence. "All right," she said. Then she hung up. I don't know exactly what she did with that information in the next 2 days. I know she pulled her credit report on the 5th day. She found the line of credit. $17,400 in her name at a lender she had never heard of, with 2 years of payment history that had been made, just barely made, just enough to keep it from going delinquent and appearing on her credit from money she couldn't account for when she looked at the household accounts. She also found a second credit card in her name she'd never opened. A $4,200 balance on a Visa card at an address that wasn't hers. She called me at 9 in the morning. She was driving somewhere I could hear the car, the particular sound of her engine on the highway. She pulled over after about 30 seconds. "I need Len's number," she said. I gave it to her. She wrote it down. She stayed on the line for a moment after. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, you saw something was wrong for years. It wasn't a question. I saw things I couldn't act on," I said. "There's a difference." "What did you see?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the way he moved Carol's bowl, about the redirected financial conversations, about the too fast agreements and the careful redirect. "Small things," I said. "Nothing you would have been able to use or that I would have been right to bring to you. Instincts." I want to be honest, I told myself it was just a father being difficult. It wasn't entirely that, but it was partially that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom would have said something to me." "Probably," I said. "What would she have said?" I thought about that. I thought about the way Carol passed food at Sunday dinners, the way she asked about what Kenny was doing, never what he was like. The way she had never once, in the 2 years she knew him, called him a good man. She called him good with Diane, which is a specific and different thing. "She would have asked you what you actually knew about his business," I said. Not as an accusation. She would have made it sound like she was curious. She would have done it over dishes or in the car. And she would have waited for the full answer before she said anything back. A silence. "She was better at that than you," Diane said. Not unkindly. "She was better at most things," I said. She exhaled. Something shifted in her breathing, the specific exhale of a person who has been holding their posture upright through will and has just decided to stop. "All right," she said. "I'll call Len." She called Len. The next few weeks were the practical weeks, the ones that looked like paperwork from the outside. Len walked her through the credit account disputes. He helped her understand the legal separation between her financial exposure and the criminal case against Kenny. Roy and Andrea Torres kept the case moving at the DA's office. The charges were filed. The accounts were formally frozen. Kenny retained a defense attorney, entered a not guilty plea, and moved into a furnished apartment on the other side of Collierville. He texted me once, in early January. The message said, "I want you to know I never meant to put your family through this. I know that doesn't change anything." I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Len and didn't respond. That was the last communication between us. Diane retained a family law attorney and filed for divorce in February. The dissolution is pending. The custody arrangement for Emma and Sophie is temporary and will be finalized through the divorce proceeding. Kenny has visitation rights that are currently being honored, which Diane has managed with a precision and fairness that I find remarkable given everything. The divorce is going to take time. These things always do. I am not going to predict the timeline or the outcome on the financial aspects. What I know is that Diane is working through it with more composure than I had any right to expect, and that her composure is real, not performed. I can tell the difference. I have been able to tell that difference for a long time. I want to tell you the honest version of what I've been sitting with since November, because I think that's the point of telling a story like this, not the outcome, but what the outcome costs and what it teaches. The first thing I've been sitting with, I saw warning signs for 4 years, and I didn't act on them because I was protecting my daughter's happiness. I want to be clear that I don't fully regret that I would make the same call again, because the signs I saw were not evidence, and going to Diane with impressions would have been more likely to damage my relationship with her than to protect her from Kenny. Acting on instinct before you have the information to back it up creates more harm than it prevents. I know that from 2.5 decades of watching it happen. But here's what I am sitting with. I also didn't ask questions. Not because I didn't have the skills to ask the right questions, I absolutely did, but because asking questions would have required me to acknowledge to myself that I was doing it. And acknowledging that I was investigating my son-in-law would have meant acknowledging that I believed something was wrong, and acknowledging that would have meant making a decision about what to do with it. I wasn't ready to make that decision, so I filed the observations away and let them sit. That choice cost $43,000 and cost Diane whatever it cost her to find out in the way she found out. I'm not sure what the right answer was. I've thought about it many times in the past months, and I don't have a clean resolution. What I know is that every time I notice something about a person and choose not to examine it further because examining it would be uncomfortable, I'm making a bet that the thing I'm not examining is going to stay manageable. Sometimes that bet pays off. Sometimes it doesn't. The second thing, Kenny Mears was not, I have come to believe, a person who set out to become a criminal. That's not an excuse. It is not one at all. But I think it's important to understand because it's true and because the alternative narrative is cleaner and more comfortable and less accurate. He made a deal, he lost, he panicked, and instead of telling the truth, he reached for the nearest available option. And then the next one, and the next. That's not a monster. That's a man who failed a series of character tests under pressure and kept failing them rather than stopping and accepting the consequences. I've read that pattern in interview rooms for 26 years. The first bad decision is almost always panic. Everything after that is a choice. What he did was a serious crime, and it will have serious consequences. Those two things are both true. The fact that I understand how it started doesn't change what it became. I want to say one more thing about Kenny Mears, and then I want to leave it where it belongs. He spent 6 years in this family. He was a real presence in Emma's and Sophie's lives. He taught Emma to throw a baseball in my backyard when she was 6 years old. He sat up with Sophie when she had a high fever in January of 2022, and Diane needed to sleep. Those things happened. The question I keep coming back to is whether those things were real, and I don't think that question has a clean answer. I think he was performing a version of himself that included those things, and the performance was not entirely false. It was built on real material. That's what makes it complicated. That's what makes it cost more than a simple fraud story costs. The third thing is harder to say. I spent the first week after I told Diane thinking about Carol, about the bowl, about the way she passed food at Sunday dinners, about the way she asked about what Kenny was doing, but never what he was like. I think Carol knew. Not specifics, she was gone before any of this started. But she had the read. She had the patient, honest, specific read on this man that she'd developed over the 2 years she knew him before she got sick. And she didn't say it out loud. I've tried to understand why. I think she was doing the same calculation I did that telling Diane without evidence would cause more harm than good. That the right move was to watch and wait and be ready to respond when the time came. She was protecting Diane the same way I was. She was just doing it with less information and less time because she ran out of time. I kept the bowl on the kitchen counter where Diane left it the morning after I told her. It's still there. She used it last Sunday when she brought the girls for dinner, filled it with roasted potatoes, set it in the center of the table. Emma and Sophie sat on either side of it doing what they've done at this table their whole lives. Talking over each other and fighting about who got more and telling me about their weeks, like the things that happened to them this week were the most important things that had happened to anyone. They were right about that. I want to say something to anyone who is watching this and recognizes something in it. Not about fraud, about the quieter part. About the thing you have noticed and filed away and decided not to examine yet because examining it would require you to make a decision you're not ready for. The thing is still there. It's not getting smaller on its own. And the longer you wait to look at it clearly, the more it will cost someone you love when it finally surfaces. I'm not saying act before you have information. I'm saying pay attention to what you are deliberately not paying attention to. Those two things are different. One is wisdom, the other is avoidance. The distance between them is where the damage accumulates. Here's where things are, as of this spring. The $43,800 from the First Tennessee account will be addressed in the criminal restitution. Len tells me recovery in fraud cases like this varies considerably. I shouldn't count on seeing all of it. I have accounted for the possibility that I don't and made the necessary adjustments. I want to be honest. The money mattered at 62 when I deposited it. At 67, it matters less than it would have. I will be all right. The money is not the part that keeps me up at night. Diane's credit accounts were disputed through Len's firm. 2 of the 3 fraudulent lines have already been removed from her record. The 3rd is under dispute and will likely resolve in her favor within the year. She is working with a financial counselor, rebuilding the picture of what her household finances actually look like without the layer of concealment Kenny maintained for 2 years. That process is slow and requires her to look at things that are uncomfortable to look at. She is doing it. She is doing it the way Carol did difficult things completely without performing the difficulty to anyone else in the time it takes. The divorce is moving through the courts. These things take time, and this one is complicated by the criminal case, which creates a parallel timeline that Diane's attorney has to navigate around. She and Kenny have agreed on a temporary custody arrangement for Emma and Sophie. They move between homes on a schedule that is consistent and predictable. The girls have a calendar in Diane's kitchen with red days and blue days, and both of them have memorized it. Children at this age understand schedule better than explanation. Emma is 11. She is old enough to know that something serious has happened, and young enough that the adults around her are still trying to decide how much to tell her and when. She's been quieter at Sunday dinners since December. Not sad, exactly more watchful. She reminds me of something I was at her age, a person who is paying attention and deciding what to do with what they notice. I think about that sometimes. Sophie is 8. Sophie asks direct questions and expects direct answers. And when she doesn't get them, she asks the same question differently until she finds an angle that works. Last Saturday, she asked me why Uncle Kenny doesn't come to my house anymore. I told her that sometimes grown-ups need to be in different places for a while, and that she would still see him at her other house. She nodded. Then she said, "Are you sad about it?" I looked at her, 8 years old. Her grandmother's eyes. "A little," I said, "but I'm okay." She nodded again, that specific nod she has. That means she's filing the information for later, and went back to looking for pecans in the yard. She found 3 and put them in her jacket pocket, and I don't know what happened to them after that. What I don't know how to quantify is the cost of what Diane's going through that isn't on a credit report. She was 6 years into a marriage. She had built a household, a routine, a set of understandings with another person that she thought were mutual and real. She had made every decision about her life for 6 years, where to live, how to spend, what to save for, how to organize the week and the year and the future, with the assumption that the person she was making those decisions with was operating from the same set of facts she had. He wasn't. The floor of her understanding of her own adult life had a significant gap in it that she didn't know was there. That's not a credit report problem. That's the kind of thing that shows up at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and your children are asleep and you're trying to figure out what you actually know about your own life. I have not said this to Diane because she doesn't need me to name it for her. She knows. She comes for Sunday dinners. She brings the girls. She brings food, something she made, in Carol's bowl, set in the center of the table where it belongs. We eat the way we've always eaten. We talk about Emma's school project and Sophie's soccer tournament and what I've been doing in the yard and what Diane is reading. Some Sundays we don't mention Kenny at all. Some Sundays a reference comes up and passes through the conversation the way a piece of weather passes noted, then gone. The first Sunday after she'd been in the house for a few weeks late February, bitter cold, the kind of February in Tennessee that reminds you winter means it, she put Carol's bowl on the table the way Carol used to put it on the table. In the center, where it belonged. Not pushed to the side. I noticed. I didn't say anything. The week after that, she came into the kitchen while I was finishing the ribs and stood next to me at the stove the way she used to as a teenager, not to help, not to ask anything, just to be in the kitchen with someone. It's a thing she did when she was 15 and 16 and working through something, and she'd drift into whatever room I was in and just be there. And I learned early not to rush it by asking what was wrong. I handed her the tongs, and she turned the ribs over twice without being asked. That was enough. That was exactly enough. I am 67 years old. I spent 26 years reading people who had done things they weren't supposed to do, in rooms where the fluorescent light didn't have any mercy and neither did the silence. I retired with the specific knowledge that I was good at that job and that the skills it built in me were permanent. They don't go away when you hand back the badge. The badge is in my desk drawer. I don't display it. It's not something I need people to see. What it represents is already in how I move through the world, the patience, the observation, the particular quality of attention that people sometimes describe as calm and I think of as simply a refusal to be surprised. I was not surprised by what Kenny did. Not in the way that people mean when they use that word, not shocked. What surprised me was my own willingness, for 4 years, to file what I noticed in a drawer and close the drawer. That surprised me. I should have known better. I thought I was protecting my daughter. I was also protecting my comfort. I don't know if there's a lesson in that that's simple enough to say plainly. The closest I can get is this. The same things that make you good at your job can be applied to your life if you're willing to do the uncomfortable work of applying them. Most of us aren't always willing. We apply the skills selectively to the things we're paid to examine, to the things that are safely distanced from us. We file the close-range observations away because the close-range ones have consequences we're not ready to manage. Justine Cole was 23 years old. She had been at that bank for 8 months. She saw something in a routine comparison of 2 signatures, 2 versions of the same name, one from 1997 and one from that Tuesday in October, and she picked up the phone. That's the whole story. In one version, a 23-year-old at a bank branch in Collierville, Tennessee, did the obvious thing. The thing you're supposed to do. She didn't file it away. She didn't tell herself it was probably a misunderstanding, or that it would be awkward to ask, or that the man on the account was probably going to be annoyed by the call and it wasn't worth the friction. She just made the call. 2 minutes, maybe 3. Mr. Donovan, I just want to confirm that you authorized this transaction. That's it. That's the whole intervention. Not dramatic, not complicated. I think about that a great deal when I think about the 4 years I spent filing things in a drawer. I drive by that branch occasionally. I've been in twice to say thank you, once right after, and once in the spring when the case was progressing well. She's still there, still thorough, probably still slightly annoying to her supervisor in the way that thorough 23-year-olds sometimes are. The second time I went in, she recognized me immediately. She asked how things were going. I told her they were going the right direction. She said she was glad. She had moved on to whatever she was handling that afternoon. That's what people who do the obvious thing do. They do it, and then they move on to the next thing, because it wasn't a heroic act to them. It was just work. Just the obvious, necessary, simple thing. I spent 26 years doing the obvious, necessary thing in rooms where most people would have walked away. I got good at it in professional contexts. I got comfortable looking away in personal ones. I am 67 years old and I am still working on the difference between those two choices. The pecan tree dropped early this year, started in mid-September instead of October. I've been sweeping the back deck more than usual. I still have a paper bag in the garage from the last time Emma visited. Last Sunday, she came and collected a full bag of them, moving along the base of the tree with the methodical focus she applies to most things. She gave half to Sophie, who immediately declared she was bored and went to find something else to do. Emma watched her go, then quietly collected the pecans Sophie had dropped. She brought both bags home in the car. I watched her through the kitchen window while she did this. I thought about what Carol would have said about her. Something specific, something exactly right, in that quiet way she had. Maybe nothing. Sometimes Carol just watched too, And the watching was the whole comment. Some things don't need more than that. If you stayed all the way to the end, thank you. Hit the like button, subscribe to Behind Dad if you haven't, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. I want to ask you one question before you go, and I want you to sit with it a little before you answer. Is there something you have noticed about someone close to you that you've been filing away not because you don't see it, but because seeing it all the way would require you to do something you're not ready to do? Drop your answer in the comments. You don't need to use their name. Just tell me what you're carrying. I'll read everyone. This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or locations is coincidental.